Welcome to a Canopy interview. My name is Michael Zarathis Cook. I'm the chief editor of Canopy Magazine. And you are listening to an interview with the artist, the Moroccan Dutch artist Rufaida. And we are speaking to Rufaida because she's about to release her debut album that's titled Coming Up for Air. And it's a follow up to her EP, her self titled EP titled Rufaida, that came out about 2 years ago, which is how I first heard of her and discovered her music. And it's a great album, as you will find out in this conversation. I think of that as her debut album, that EP as her debut album, because it remains a powerful statement and introduction to her artistry. Now, artists like Rufaida, we want to cover at Canopy Magazine for a number of reasons. Um, Foremost being it's a way for us to introduce our readers and audience to artists that are maybe a little bit off the mainstream sources through which we get introduced to new artists. And it's also part of a series in Canopy Magazine that's titled Altitude. And with Altitude, it is our way of finding international alternative musicians, especially those that are working in the folk tradition. We've had over the years some great artists as a part of this series. A lot of them are part of the folk tradition in the West, so North America, UK, and so on. But we've also, especially recently, been looking for artists that reflect the spirit of international folk music, which is just another way of saying world music. But, I think a lot of people are starting to get uncomfortable with the terminology of world music and what it represents, which is sort of music of the other, quote unquote. But the spirit of international music, which is artists making music that isn't necessarily geared towards a Western audience, but nevertheless can be engaged by a Western audience. They're making music from their sort of local cultural perspective, but out towards the world. And in this issue, I feel like we have four strong artists that represent what the series is trying to capture. One of them, which is an interview that's already out, is with the artist John Batiste. Now, John Batiste is definitely not off the beaten path or off the mainstream. He's a very well celebrated American jazz musician. But the purpose of covering him in that interview that we had with him was to celebrate his own attempt at finding or building a new tent for music and building a place for music that is itself away from sort of the mainstream and the ways that music is presented, that feels sort of approved by the industry's mainstays and the gatekeepers of the industry. But the three other artists in this series do something completely different or out of the context of American music. One of them is an artist by the name of Amaya Miranda. She is an artist working in Barcelona, obviously singing in Spanish. She's a folk artist who is releasing, I believe, her third album. So you'll be hearing that interview shortly. And we also speak to an artist by the name of Oshamo, who is a Nigerian artist who recently moved to the UK. So he sings in English, but his cultural context and the style of his musical tradition is very much Nigerian. So we wanted to celebrate his artistry through that conversation and the album that's coming out. But for this interview that you're listening to, we want to celebrate Rufaida because, I believe so strongly in her music. I believe in how she presents her music and the sort of many different layers that come through her artistry. Her debut album, Coming Up for Air, is coming out on October 10th. So we're publishing this a bit early so that you can get introduced to the artist. And hopefully, please do check out that album. It's available on all streaming platforms. And I hope you enjoyed this interview as much as the both of us did. And if you did, please do consider subscribing to Canopy Magazine, becoming a paid subscriber. It's just $5 a month, and it would help us, number one, to be able to continue to have the conversations that we are having, conversations like this, and also to deliver these conversations in a way that I think pays respect to the artist and to the craft of the artist that we're covering by also presenting these conversations in a way that feels artistically inspired that is the niche that we have covered over the last 5 years of Canopy Magazine. That if we want to cover artists and art, we also have to do it in a way that's artistically engaged. So that's why you see a lot of our portraits. A lot of our portraits are illustrations rather than photography, and the writing of the profiles of these artists are also very sort of artistically engaged and inspired. So please do consider becoming a subscriber. It helps us go a long way. Rufida, thanks again for having this conversation. I think probably this conversation and a lot of the conversations that you're going to be having about this album will have to do with art and activism, because that's something that you're very conscious about. And that's something that is very present in this album coming up for air. That's out October 10th. That's correct, right? October 10th? Okay.
Yes.
And, I've been doing this for a long time now. And usually when the conversation has to do with art and activism, I try to talk about the art first, because people, the folks I'm speaking to are artists. In this case, though, I feel like either I have to talk about both at the same time or activism first. And what I mean by that is there's a little bit of a moral clock that is counting when people either put out an album, or like if you create a film, or whenever you're speaking to the public on cultural matters, how soon before you talk about Palestine, right? That for me is the moral clock. Like, if you don't talk about it by a certain time, it's almost like you're evading it. And it's a little bit funny, although there's nothing funny about this matter, that the first thing I hear when I listen to this album coming up for air is Malcolm X talking about, that is Malcolm X, right?
It actually isn't.
It
I
isn't
have
Malcolm X?
I have a confession to make
Okay.
on this. Should I do it straight away?
Yes, of course. Yes.
The confession is that I, like you, assumed that it was Malcolm X when I found the vocal sample. But when I shared the tune, like in a very late stage of the production, to a friend who is actually a Malcolm X connoisseur, like he knows everything, every speech he ever did. And he
Right.
told me, it's not him. And I looked into it, he said. And it turns out that this is an AI voice that is based on Malcolm X, because it could have been something that he would have said. But there's also kind of like the sound of Martin Luther King in there. It's not really Malcolm X. It's just a generated voice. But I found out about that quite late in the process, and the sample was already so much integrated into the production that I decided to keep it that way.
All right. So we're going to spend the rest of the conversation talking about AI. Crazy. It's like I did a cursory Google of Malcolm X saying this, and I couldn't find anything. In my mind, I was like, okay, I'll look it up after the conversation. But nevertheless, I'm
No
glad.
need.
Yes, no, I'm glad you kept it in, because this is something that even someone of his outlook and of his concerns nevertheless would have thought about, and nevertheless would have talked about. And the quote that is not Malcolm X, but someone that sounds a little bit like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, is essentially saying the Palestinian struggle is not just a cry for justice. It's a blistering battle for the most fundamental human rights. And then it goes on. But the point is that you mix that voice. Let's just call him AI Malcolm X, Malcolm AI. You mix Malcolm AI into the song so beautifully. But I'm going to return to my initial point here, which is you don't let that moral clock run at all. You talk about this issue right from the start, and it's one that is so baked into the fabric of this album. My question for you off the start is, I don't want to ask why aren't other artists doing this, but essentially, why is it so hard to mix in activism into the art that you make? Because I look at a lot of the artists putting things out now, either they talk about it in a very peripheral way, something as important as this, and there are other conflicts happening in the world, I understand, that are very important as well, or they don't talk about it at all. And in my heart of hearts, I don't want to believe that they're bad people, quote unquote, or they're doing it out of malice, but I think a little bit of it has to do with fear. So in your experience, just looking at the zeitgeist that we're living in right now, why do you think it's so hard to mix in those two things?
Well, I prefer to speak from my own experience rather than say something about what other people could potentially be feeling or thinking. But for me, it's not that hard because I feel like the larger topic that I'm interested in as an artist and as a human being in general is how colonialism is impacting how people are living together on this earth. And what's happening in Palestine is an example of how that manifests. So for me, I mean, the whole record is about these social structures that we are moving inside of. So for me, it makes perfect sense to also write about Palestine. That's my take. And I do understand that it could potentially come with a price because there's so much at stake for um, I mean, within the structure that I'm talking about of colonialism, there's big industries and people that are benefiting out of these dynamics of these power structures. And also within the industry that I am working in, the music industry, there's a very clear division of people in power that have a big gatekeeping role that could potentially influence careers. My luck, quote unquote, luck is that I am a small artist without a big label that tells me what to do. So I feel maybe more freedom to address the things that matter to me and yeah, to do what I do.
Again, I appreciate that you don't want to talk about what other people are doing, and I definitely I sympathize with that. But you talked about gatekeeping. Definitely, there are gatekeepers, no doubt about that. But then there are also the expectations and taste of the general public or of the audience that you're singing for and you're performing for. And I think up till now, I don't know if it's a rule, but there's definitely a fabric of it's a little bit cringe when an artist is activist first, artist second. Right? There's an aesthetic component to it. I feel like listening to your album and seeing other artists who are also conscious of activism in their music, in their art, films, etc. I feel like hopefully we're reaching a place now where it actually is cringe to not be an activist in your art. So do you see that as an option at all, that going forward, again, I know you don't want to talk about other artists, but is it even possible? Can you make art without contending with the times that we are living with and still be quote unquote a serious artist?
That's a very hard question. I think it really depends on what your intentions as an artist are. And I would rather watch a show that does not address any activist topics if it's not, like you mentioned, like part of the identity of the art. If there's an artist that makes a beautiful record about heartache and it's about heartache, then why couldn't it just be about heartache? I mean, that's also something valid and universal. And if it's done right, it could also still be lived and experienced by an audience. It could be interpreted as so many things. I mean, heartache could be in a romantic way, could be in many other ways. I don't know. I don't feel artists should be like you said. I actually, when I was playing at a festival last week, there were hardly any artists that did not speak out about Palestine. And sometimes I feel like it's more of a performative thing than to do it. So maybe I would rather not have all the artists do it if they don't really have anything to say about it. You know what I mean? But at the same time, it's also like it does impact like the general opinion of people. So there's two sides to the coin, if you catch my drift.
I 100% catch your drift, and this is where this question is coming from, because the artists that are doing it performatively, who maybe whatever reason that they're doing it, I think one of the reasons that they're doing it is because it's a little bit uncomfortable to want to connect emotionally with people from the stage to the audience without talking about something that is so heartbreaking in our public consciousness. I think that's, if you're going to sing about heartbreak, romantic heartbreak, you have every right to do that, and it can just be that. But it's almost like there's an elephant in the room that people don't know yet how to contend with without coming off as performative or phony, etc. And by the way, congratulations on opening the festival that you mentioned is the Lowlands Festival, which I think was a very last minute invitation, and you opened that festival. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's massive. One of the heartbreaks that I think this album also contends with is diasporic belonging. And we'll talk more about the album in a second, but I just want to use these questions as a sort of background of where you're coming from as a complete artist and person. But diasporic belonging is something that the first time I heard your music, which was about 2 years ago, I think most people discovered you through Don't Bend, which is from your self-titled EP. The diasporic spirit was so apparent. And I think it's one that people connect with, even if they're not a part of a diaspora, right? Which is, it's one thing to inspire other people that are also diasporic. But when you've created something that people who are native to where they live can still connect with, I think there's something really special about that. But before we get into this, could you maybe just talk a little bit about your own personal history as a musician? You're Dutch Moroccan. Were you born in Morocco or in the Netherlands?
So I was born in in the Netherlands, wrong country. But my parents were born in Morocco and came to the Netherlands as children of labor migrants in the 60s and 70s of the previous century. So they came here as teens, and they met here in the Netherlands, and I was born here. So I've always felt Dutch first, especially in a context in which I was mostly surrounded by the dominant white Western Dutch group in my upbringing. It took until my teens, or later, it took until after my music education. I went to a conservatory after high school, which was also predominantly a white place. It took until after for me to start to reappreciate Moroccan culture. And I started discovering it through music, actually, by setting some rules for me to create the EP that you were just referring to. Please interrupt if I'm going too quick, because I don't remember what your original question was.
Well, no, you've sort of answered it, which is the background of where you're coming from. And I actually love the fact that you accidentally said Morocco in terms of where you were born, because it shows how completely mixed your cultural backgrounds are. And you're someone that appears white passing, as in, without this context, people will just think you're Dutch. But you talk about something on this idea of white passing that I think is it's a really good background for this album, which is this idea of the tolerance trap. Because maybe until very recently in the West, the idea of tolerance was a virtue. It still is, but I think part of what you mean by the tolerance trap, more and more people are waking up to how tolerance is either the bare minimum or can even have some unsavory components to it.
No, I meant that most people, like the dominant group, would still consider tolerance as a virtue. I think it's a small group actually that starts to see it as a problematic aspect of how culture is organizing itself.
And what is problematic about it in your own personal experience?
What is problematic about it is that I feel like a dominant group tolerating a minority is that it is confirming a power dynamic that does not comply with the idea of what equality is and what everybody is so quick to say they believe in. If you ask a regular person on the street, do you believe in equality? They would say yes. But the principle of how tolerance works is telling us something else.
I I think it might be a little bit difficult to appreciate how boundary pushing that idea is. And unfortunately, when something is true, it's not really pushing any boundaries. It's just true. But because of the context that we live in, that really is a boundary pushing idea. Because for the folks who don't understand what you mean, it would be a little bit crazy to have an issue with tolerance, that there's a dominant group that's tolerating a minority, or even let's maybe not use the word tolerance and use the word accepting. So what you're saying, which I have lived this experience just from my own personal experience, but I think there are many different variations from the folks listening and just in general, people who are diasporic to a Western culture can appreciate this idea of you tolerating me is actually not the thinking that I need your permission to either exist or participate confirms this dominance our hierarchy that you've established. Am I characterizing that correctly?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
So this tolerance trap has kept me for a long time in my forming years, trying to conform to the dominant group's norms and values. Because I've sensed as a child from a very young age already that it would not benefit my position in society to not comply with the boundaries of the tolerance trap or cage. And it's taken me a long time to understand how that can be very limiting in finding out who you are, or where your truth lies.
So as a follow-up question to that, what does the alternative look like? And I know that's a super difficult question, but from your own lived experience, what does true equality look like in that context because the fact that there's a dominant culture, there's nothing we can do about that. And that may or may never change. But what then is the ideal preferred way? And you can speak just for yourself here, in which a dominant culture and a diasporic identity coexists, especially when it comes to like creativity, art, identity, etc.
Yeah, I think it's about color, but it's also about gender, about sexuality. It's about all these aspects that could be considered minorities in a way. My answer is that I'm actually still trying to figure that out, and that playground, or my lab in which I test how this works for me, is either the studio or the stage, where I make room for testing the edges of how far I can reach, because that's kind of like a safe and controlled environment in which experimentation is actually part of the playbook. I've come to realize that it's a beautiful way to explore. For example, I'm trying to figure out how I feel about wearing a headscarf in a more traditional way. And I'm finding that very difficult in my regular daily life, because I feel the world is looking down on me if I wear it in the grocery store or wherever. But on stage, it's my universe in which I decide what's valuable and what's not. And it's easier to take that freedom because of the controlled setting that it is.
It's always just so funny when you see that dichotomy. Something that, as you've just said, is happening in the grocery store. You look down on it, but when you see it on stage, it can be the same person. Now you're looking at this identity as something to be celebrated. It's just funny how human psychology works in that sense. But this last point is something that is also, I think, unique about this album, but also Rufaidah, the artist, is that you're figuring it out as you go. And there's something really vulnerable about that, which I'm sure comes at a personal cost, but creatively, I think the benefits far outweigh the cost when you're willing to not have all the answers before you present where you are in the evolution of your creativity. And I think that might be some of the traps that people who are performing their activism or even their art fall into, this idea that you need to have a finished product or a finished view of the world or of an issue in order before you can express it. And I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate about this album is its wayfinding. All right, let's finally talk about the album, which it's very different from your EP, and you're billing it as your debut album, which is technically true, but I take offense to that because as far as I'm concerned, and I think as far as a lot of your fans are concerned, your debut EP, Rufaida, that is the perfect introduction to, I think, this creative universe that you're building. But I will say, in defense of this being your debut album, some of the streamlines that were established in Rufaida, the EP, feel like they're fully mature now in this album. And one of those streamlines is this fusion of pop, like Euro pop, in like a very fun way, and identities, musical traditions, and languages of the Middle East and North Africa. I tried to come up with the term Aeropop, and I thought I'd come up with like a new term, but then I Googled it, and I think a couple other people have used it. But maybe you could summarize a little bit what the influences are for this album in terms of culture, language, and also musical traditions.
Thank you so much for appreciating the EP. It means a lot because it was a project that before I'm answering your question, it was a project that I produced by myself during COVID in my home studio, never expecting a song like Don't Bend to travel to so many places in the world, and it's just such a great motivation to continue knowing that people appreciate it. So thanks. And for this new record, I wanted to establish a sound that is both pop and accessible in a way, but at the same time with my way of bringing North Africa and bringing Arab poetry and influences. And I feel that there's quite some artists that have done it in a very slick pop way, and this is maybe more of an indie alternative approach with more guitars and live elements like that. Yeah, it's there's some Afro influences in it because I'm a big fan of everything that comes from Nigeria and many other places. I wanted to create a record that is danceable, that would get people moving. And at the same time, I wanted to bring something real, to tell a real story about these power structures that define our lives and define our gaze. And try to create a universe in which all of these elements can coexist, if that answers your question.
It does, and it inspires many other questions, but I don't want to keep you for too long here, but that's one of the things also that I appreciate about this album is that it feels Pan-African, but it's also, it invites other elements into the African context. I'm Nigerian, so I definitely hear some of like the Fuji aspect, like sort of very danceable. Yeah, I guess Fuji would be the closest drum beat aesthetic that I hear in this album. I also hear Moroccan Nawa music, which I've discovered in the last like 5 years, and I'm absolutely obsessed with. And there's nothing like it in the musical tradition of the world. What was your process of discovering Moroccan music? So you mentioned earlier that when you were in your teenage years, you kind of had a revival of, I guess, falling in love with your own heritage from the Moroccan side. Were there specific artists that you were listening to, or what was it about this musical tradition that caught your ear?
It kind of came hand in hand with my personal journey back towards religion or belief. Faith is a better word because I'm not too sure about organized religion. But I learned about Sufism, which is a direction within Islam that is all about art and music and using music also to get into higher spirits. And Gnawa music is in particular a kind of music that has that quality. I was just listening a lot to Gnawa, but also to other Moroccan genres like Shabi music and music from the north of Morocco where my parents were born, which is Amazigh, which is also where the original people of Morocco lived. Morocco was colonized by the Arabs, and before it was only Amazigh people living there. Yeah, so I was like swimming in this beautiful well of very diverse music genres, and when I was considering using Moroccan music as a source of inspiration, the first instrument that came to mind that I wanted to try was the gembri, which is the bass, Moroccan or North African bass that plays a very big role in Gnawa music because it's like the driving force and the repetitive groove machine that is the foundation of that genre. And I don't remember your question. Like, how did I get into Moroccan music?
Yeah, which is what you're answering currently.
Yeah, that's how it started. And then I had one build during COVID in Essaouira, like the Gnawa capital of Morocco, of the
Mhm.
world. And it was shipped to Rotterdam where I was living, and I unwrapped it and I was like, okay, so what is the the mantra, or like what's the words that I want to sing to myself to be, sorry, my English is a bit lacking here.
I guess capture the spirit of this instrument. What are the words that match the spirit of the instrument? Is that a fair way to put it?
No, it's more like because Gnawa music is all about these repetitive lines to bring yourself into a kind of into the higher spirits and into the mood or into like this trance like state of mind. Which words do I want to sing to myself in order to get to that place? And then I take what I need, I leave what I don't. That way I don't bend. These words came to me, and that's just how my relationship with Gnawa came to be as a creator, because as a listener, I already had my relation to that genre. And that was very scary because I felt insecure and I had all these questions about, am I allowed? Am I appropriating my own culture? What does this mean? I guess questions that people that are diasporic can relate to. If you're not born and raised into a culture, these lines are sometimes very vague. Yeah, sorry, I'm babbling.
No. I actually really find that. So was "Don't Bend," which are the lyrics that you just quoted. I take what I want and I leave what I don't. I'm sure I just butchered those lyrics, but were those the first song that you wrote for this instrument or on this instrument?
Yeah.
Like folks, please listen to that song. It's incredible, and it's just that's crazy that that's the first song you wrote for this instrument because it feels like a bit of an anthem. It's an anthem for diasporas. And I think that's the reason I'm fascinated by that is because it sort of answers the conundrum that you've just articulated, which is your relation to a culture that you are from, but you might not have been born in, which is ultimately, and I see a lot of Nigerians who live abroad or maybe were born abroad doing this. I happen to have been born in Nigeria and I grew up there, which is how do you engage with that culture?
my attitude has always been you do exactly what you do with the culture that you're living in right now, right? So you take what works for you, what feels human to you, and you leave what doesn't. And I think a version of that is true for most people, which is you don't have to be 100% Moroccan, so to speak, or 100% Dutch, so to speak, because no one's 100% either of those things, right? Even if you're 100% Moroccan, you've just articulated the difference between Amazigh and people who are maybe more of an Arabic background or culture. So even within this monolith of Moroccan culture, there are so many different shades, and that much is even more true when you go into what does it mean to be Dutch. So it's one of those musical miracles that the first thing that you write for this instrument is, and I think maybe I should make a playlist of Gnawa music for the listener here, because there are elements of it. I imagine Hassan Bousou, the musician. So there are elements of his music, especially, that are built and cultivated to put you in a musical trance. And I see that you struggle to describe that trance because
Yeah.
in Western tradition, like a lot of our music in the West has to do with observation and the divide between performance and the audience, which is not, that context does not permit the trance-like state of mind that music of African traditions, where there is no divide between the audience and the performer. And the performer, and so there's been a certain extent, is a member of the audience, and the audience performs alongside, et cetera, et cetera. Another thing about this album that I have to talk about is the visual language, the aesthetic of it. I could spend
Thank you.
hours talking about this because I think I'll just abbreviate it this way, that we started talking about your activism. And I wanted to get that out of the way because it's so mixed in with your art. And I sincerely believe that for any sort of zeitgeist or revolution to last, it has to begin with an aesthetic revolution. That it needs to sort of question the basis of how it presents itself. And there's so much with how you present Rufa'ida that, to be honest, feels very Dutch, but is not.
In what way? Tell me more
So,
about it.
oh my goodness. I tried to come up with, because I try to articulate this before this conversation, but okay, so a lot of the way your music videos are gorgeous, by the way. The colors are incredibly vivid, and they all remind me of like a Vermeer painting, right? Where the colors are very vivid, very primary, and there's
Uh-huh.
just like inherently Dutch in its aesthetic. However, because of who you are, the accents, in terms of visual accents that you incorporate, and the full-throated commitment to color, right? We live in a world that is a little bit shy of intense reds, intense yellows, intense blues. But in other parts of the world, Africa especially, that shyness doesn't exist. So seeing this aesthetic marriage between the vernaculars of European Dutch aesthetics and also something that's obviously inherently Arab, obviously inherently African, I think is such a powerful call to action in a way that words and sometimes music can't do.
Loving it.
But how would you describe your aesthetic, or at least what are some of the wells that you draw from when it comes to the Rufa'ida look? Because it's a very particular look, it's a very specific look, and it's a look that I feel is as cultivated as your music.
Well, I have to be honest with you. Visuals are not my strong suit. So what I'm good at is finding people that are strong at it. And for example, for the cover of this record, I collaborated with a Belgian Moroccan photographer, and he is very known for his way to bridge worlds culturally. And I read some interviews of his, and I felt like we are very much connected in the way we think about art, and we think about the marriage between cultures and unapologeticness is a big topic for him in his work. So I
And
thought, huh?
I just think we need to give him a shout out. So I think his name is Moose Lamrabat.
Yes, Moose Lamrabat, of course.
Yes.
You're completely right. So for me, it was a big dream actually to work with him because he's done so many beautiful things. And I reached out and I asked him if he wanted to co-develop a concept for this record. So the idea of the cover image is completely his and of Lisa Labau. She's an art director from Belgium. They are a duo and they do lots of projects together. Yeah, so I think they really mastered it, and they also really pushed me to those limits that I was talking about earlier that are very hard to reach in daily life, but are easier to discover in a controlled setting of art or music creation, or in this case, photography. Because in this image on the cover of my record, I'm wearing kind of like a burqa. It's not really a burqa because my face is not covered, but it's like a long veil from head to toe, and it's you're looking at a sky basically. I'm wearing the sky, and at that point I had never played a concert veiled, and I was shooting the record artwork covered up like that, and that was very scary because I didn't know how that would define me or how people would perceive an image like that. But it was very comfortable to be in the hands of Moose and Lisa and to just go for it, because I knew deep down that it would come out beautifully, but I really needed also this collaboration with another North African diasporic creator to get me to that point to actually go there. Yeah, so thank you so much for all your credits on my visuals, but I have very little to do with the quality that came out.
Well, I think it's a credit to Moose and Lisa that they have to see something in your music and your overall aesthetic creatively, especially the sounds that you operate in, to be able to bring that to life. And what they've done, what all of you have done, it's hard to describe, but folks, when you see it, it feels like something is being birthed in how this sort of music, this zeitgeist of music is communicated that wasn't there before. And there's something incredibly important and worth celebrating about that. All right, I'll let you go soon, but maybe we could just talk quickly about 3 songs. The first one is Can Ness, which we talked about, which opens the album. I believe it's also the song that uses poetry from a Palestinian poet. A few lines from a Palestinian poet. Who was that poet being Mahmoud Darwish? Who was that, and what inspired you to select some of his poetry for this album?
Yeah, so he's a very famous, maybe one of the most famous Palestinian poets of all times. And he has always expressed the situation of the Palestinian people and the impact of occupation on Palestinian people in his work in a very beautiful way. And yeah, so it felt very natural to use some of his work, because why would I try and find new words if someone with so much agency already gave words to such a difficult experience? Sorry for my cat who is here to talk with us. Hope it doesn't disturb you too much. But yeah, that's how he came to be part of the record.
And another song, which is, I feel like it's the capital city of this album, Friendly Fire. And the lyrics, "We will never be like them, honey," is one that repeats over and over. We've talked a lot about this today, but maybe the final words on this. How do you define we, and how do you define them in a very general sense from your perspective and experience?
Yeah, we being the minority and them being the dominant group. I think that's the short answer to that question. But why do you feel like it's the capital song of the record?
Because of those words, and also it's my favorite song in the album, selfishly, but because of those words, because it those two words are, I think, some of the hardest words to define in the English language, which is who is we and who they are, who's them. Because at any point, anyone in the dominant hierarchy, and so much of progress happens because of this. At any point in their life, anyone in the dominant hierarchy can decide that this doesn't serve the kind of life that I want to live anymore. Because you talked about this idea of you don't want to be limited creatively because of this relationship to that dominance hierarchy or the dominant culture, whatever. It's also limiting for people who live in that, because you've made an album that feels international because of some of the names and influences that we've talked about. You brought up Belgium. Obviously it's Dutch in its own way because you're Dutch. It's Morocco, but there's a song here, for example, Li Beirut, that I guess it's like a traditional Lebanese song, but like there's so much about the world that's in this album, and in a way it feels so much bigger than the Western gaze and the fairly limited Western perspective. So all of this to say that there are members of that dominance group that feel limited by their dominance, if that makes sense. So the reason I think Friendly Fire is, or at least it's the one that I connect with the most, but also captures some of what we're saying here, is the we is difficult for a reason that I'll get to shortly, but the them, I think, is fluid, because you can decide at any point that the dominance doesn't serve you because it's limiting, and there's a world that's bigger out there. In Canada, who we think of as the minority in Canada is actually the global majority. And I'm sure that's true in the Netherlands as well, that these quote unquote minorities on the global scale, there are more of us than in our local setting. But lastly, sorry, I know this is going on for so long, but this idea of you're making music that I think a lot of diasporic people can connect with. And I'm curious, from the level of like just an artist and a creative that's making a career out of this, how do you build an audience that is in flux? That, for example, if I'm Moroccan and I'm listening to your music, do I understand your music as Moroccan when you're singing in that style? Or if I'm Dutch and I'm listening to your music, do I understand your music as Dutch when it's very obviously has all these other things happening in it? So like, do you ever think about the hill that you're up against when you don't have a baked in culturally stable audience?
I don't consider myself a culturally stable person, and I guess there's more of us out there, and I think that's my intended listener. And I think the majority of the world population now is somewhere in between cultures, is a third culture kid struggling to define where to go, who to go with, who to listen to. So I try to look at it as a very big population that is all part of my potential audience, instead of looking at it from these separated places in the world. Because I do experience, actually, here in the Netherlands, it's a challenge to find my audience here, because the system of pop music is very much built by this dominant group that has an idea of what's worth listening to and how it should be listened to, and all these kinds of things. So it's a necessity for me to also go beyond borders. I think my team, for example, the people that are working with me on this project are based in Belgium for a very good reason, because Belgium and the Netherlands might sound like the same country for you over there in Canada, but it's a very different music culture and a very different way of appreciating diversity and Yeah, it is a challenge from an industry perspective to find that audience. But yeah, I just look around myself. I see my friends who are all coming from all kinds of places, and yeah, I feel like there's a lot of potential. It's just a matter of time before the right audience finds me and I find them. But yeah, it's very interesting also to see how different an audience responds to my work. For example, we did a tour in Morocco. That's a very different concert experience from Istanbul or Berlin or Amsterdam. And that's also the beauty of music because it can work differently in different contexts. And I just hope that this record and my music in general resonates in any way because I don't want to define how it should be resonating to an audience. Yeah, that's the goal.